When I landed in Los Angeles, I ran straight to the hospital. The ICU was cold, white, and humming with machines. My daughter lay on the bed, her face drained of color, her chest rising with every forced breath from the tubes. I wished that I was here, that she wasn't alone, even though her eyes stayed shut. But her husband wasn't there. He was in a casino, laughing, tossing chips like life was a joke. Then I took every dollar back. 1 hour later, he had nothing left but madness. If you want to know what real justice looks like, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. The call came at 3 a.m. Chicago time. I recognized Nadine's number immediately. She'd been Marlene's best friend since nursing school, now working at Cedars-Sinai, where my daughter had started her health tech startup. Her voice cracked through the phone like breaking glass. Marlene was in the ICU. Critical condition. Something about poisoning, but the doctors couldn't identify the source. I threw clothes into a bag without looking, booked the first flight out, while the Uber waited outside. The driver kept trying to make conversation about the weather, about traffic, about anything except the fact that my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stared at my phone, at the last text from Marlene 3 days ago, just a photo of her morning smoothie with a thumbs-up emoji. She looked tired in the reflection on the glass, but I'd blamed it on her startup grinding her down. The hospital corridor stretched forever. That particular shade of beige that tried to be calming, but only made everything feel more sterile. Nadine met me at the ICU entrance, her scrubs wrinkled like she'd been wearing them for days. She hugged me tight, and I felt her trembling too. She led me through the double doors into a world of beeping machines. Room 12. Through the glass, I saw my daughter for the first time in 2 months. She lay there, looking smaller than I remembered, her skin almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. The ventilator pushed air into her lungs with mechanical precision. 16 breaths per minute dropping to 12, then climbing back to 22. The numbers danced on the monitor, refusing to stabilize. I sat in the visitor's chair beside Marlene's bed. Her hand felt cold when I took it, her fingers limp. The IV lines ran into her arm like tiny highways. Nadine explained what she knew about unknown toxins, organ stress, and the medical team running every test imaginable. Marlene had collapsed at her office yesterday afternoon. The startup team thought it was exhaustion at first. She'd been working 18-hour days to close their Series A funding. But when she didn't respond to normal treatment, when her breathing became labored, they knew something was seriously wrong. The way Nadine kept glancing at the door, checking her phone, suggested there was more to the story. I asked about Garrett, trying to keep my voice neutral. My son-in-law and I had never been close. He was one of those crypto traders who talked about blockchain at every family dinner. Nadine's expression shifted slightly. Garrett was in New York, she said. Emergency business trip. Some crucial trading opportunities that couldn't wait. He'd been calling every few hours for updates and sounded absolutely devastated. His flight back kept getting delayed due to weather issues on the East Coast. He was trying to rent a car, maybe drive back if the flights didn't resume soon. The way she recited this information felt rehearsed. I pulled out my phone to call him. The number rang 4 times before he picked up, and immediately I heard background noise voices, some kind of announcement, ambient sounds that seemed oddly familiar, but I couldn't place. His voice came through strained and exhausted. He apologized for not being there, said he was stuck at JFK and had been sleeping in the airport lounge for 12 hours waiting for flights to resume. He asked about Marlene's condition, and when I told him what little I knew, I heard what sounded like a sob. The call dropped after a few minutes, and he said the airport Wi-Fi was overloaded. Marlene's purse sat on the bedside table. I looked through it, needing something to do with my hands. Wallet, keys, phone with a dead battery, a handful of receipts. I glanced at 1 vitamin D, calcium supplements, and protein powder from a health store in Brentwood. Marlene had always been health conscious, even more so since starting her company. The receipt was dated 2 weeks ago, paid in cash, which was odd since Marlene always used cards for expense tracking. I folded it and put it in my pocket without really thinking about it. Nadine brought me coffee from the cafeteria and sat with me for a while. Then, almost casually, she mentioned that Marlene had been having some strange symptoms lately. Nothing dramatic, just excessive thirst. She'd been drinking 12, sometimes 15 bottles of water a day. Blamed it on the Los Angeles heat, even though it was October. Also some hand tremors when she held her coffee cup, but she'd laughed it off as too much caffeine. Classic startup founder problems, she'd said. The symptoms had started about 2 months ago, right around the time Garrett had begun his new trading venture. The doctor came in around 4, a tired-looking woman who introduced herself and explained they were running expanded toxicology panels. Marlene's symptoms didn't match typical food poisoning or environmental exposure. The progression had been gradual, then sudden, like something had been building up in her system over time. They'd know more when the test results came back, probably by morning. In the meantime, they were treating the symptoms, supporting her organs, and keeping her stable. The medical terminology washed over me, but I understood the basics. They were keeping my daughter alive while trying to figure out what was killing her. My phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. Still stuck at the airport. Managed to book a rental car. Going to drive straight through. Should be there in 2 days max. Love to Marlene. Tell her I'm coming. The message felt off somehow. Too formal. But people handled crises differently, I reminded myself. I pulled up his location, sharing something Marlene had insisted we all do as a family safety measure. The location showed JFK Airport, exactly as he'd said. Technology didn't lie. So why did I feel like something was wrong? Evening settled over Los Angeles, the city lights visible through the small window. Marlene's condition hadn't changed stable but critical, the nurses said. I held her hand and talked to her, telling her about the flight, about how her apartment building's doorman had remembered me. Around 9 o'clock, Marlene's hand twitched in mine. Just slightly, barely noticeable. Then her lips moved. Just a fraction, like she was trying to speak. The nurse checked the monitors and said it was probably involuntary muscle movement, but I knew my daughter. She was trying to tell me something. I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke to my phone vibrating. Another text from Garrett, time-stamped 3:45 a.m. Eastern. Car rental fell through. Trying another company. This is a nightmare. How is she? If he was at JFK, why was he texting at 3:45 in the morning? Wouldn't the rental counters be closed? I took a photo of Marlene and sent it to him with a simple message. No change. Hurry. Dawn came slowly to the ICU. The morning nurse checked Marlene's vitals, adjusted her position, changed out IV bags with practiced precision. Everything tracked by computers, recorded in databases. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure stable. But those breathing numbers kept fluctuating 16, 22, 12, 18. No pattern, no stability. The nurse said it was concerning, but not immediately dangerous. Nadine arrived with her morning shift, looking more rested but still worried. She brought me fresh coffee and a bagel from the good cafe across the street. We sat together watching Marlene breathe with mechanical assistance. Then Nadine mentioned that she'd been thinking about the timeline. Marlene's symptoms, the thirst, the tremors had started about 2 months ago. It was probably just a coincidence, but the timing was interesting. Still, 2 months of escalating symptoms that no one had really noticed or questioned. It made her wonder what else they'd all missed. The doctor arrived at 8 with test results. Her expression was carefully neutral as she explained what they'd found. Heavy metal poisoning, definitely, but not lead or mercury or any of the usual suspects. The specific compound was still being identified, but the pattern suggested chronic exposure over several weeks or months, with a recent acute spike that triggered the collapse. She'd ordered more specialized tests, consulted with toxicology experts. They'd have definitive answers soon, probably by afternoon. They'd started chelation therapy to help remove the metal from Marlene's system. My phone rang Garrett again. This time the background noise was different, but when I asked where he was, he said he was at a rest stop in Pennsylvania, had been driving for 6 hours straight. The rental car had come through after all. He sounded exhausted, strung out. He kept asking about Marlene's condition, whether the doctors had figured out what was wrong. When I mentioned the heavy metal poisoning, there was a long pause. Then he started talking fast, saying it must be environmental, maybe something in their apartment building, old pipes or lead paint. After the call, I sat there staring at my phone. The location sharing still showed Garrett at JFK Airport, hadn't moved in 12 hours. Either the GPS was malfunctioning or something else was going on. I looked at Marlene, still unconscious, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The morning stretched on with more tests, more waiting, more mechanical breathing. As I studied every detail of Marlene's face, memorizing it, something metallic rolled across the floor. I bent down to pick up a poker chip, old and worn, sticky with someone's sweat. It wasn't mine. I'd never seen it before, but somehow it had fallen from Marlene's purse when I'd moved it earlier. On its face was etched, "I owe you," and a number that made my blood run cold. 5 million. The waiting room became my second home over the next 48 hours. I'd memorized every water stain on the ceiling tiles, learned the shift patterns of every nurse on the ICU floor. Marlene's condition hadn't changed. Still critical. Still on the ventilator. The chelation therapy was working slowly, pulling the mystery metal from her blood drop by drop. The doctor said patience was essential now. Her body needed time to heal. Silas arrived on the second morning, looking every inch the successful Seattle lawyer despite having taken a red-eye flight. He hugged me. We'd never been close, but the crisis had a way of breaking down walls. He'd brought flowers, white roses, and lilies that looked more suited for a funeral than a hospital room. He explained that Garrett had called him, devastated, asking him to come since he was still stuck with his travel situation. As the family lawyer, Silas felt it was his duty to be here, to help with any legal or medical decisions that might arise. His hands were steady as he handed me the flowers, but I noticed a slight tremor when he signed the visitor log, probably exhaustion from the flight. We sat together in Marlene's room, watching the machines do their work. Silas asked careful questions about her condition, taking notes on his phone. When I mentioned the heavy metal poisoning, his typing paused for just a moment before resuming. He suggested we should document everything for potential insurance claims. If this was environmental poisoning from their apartment building, there might be liability issues. The way he talked about it, so matter-of-fact about the business side of my daughter's suffering, was just his lawyer training showing through. Nadine joined us during her lunch break, bringing coffee for everyone. As we sat there, she mentioned that Marlene had been having other symptoms too. The excessive thirst, yes, but also weight loss despite eating normally. Marlene had dropped about 15 pounds in the last 2 months, and had been thrilled about it actually. And there were the headaches, sudden and severe. Silas took notes of everything, asking follow-up questions about dates and severity. Professional thoroughness. Nothing more. Then Nadine mentioned something that changed the atmosphere in the room. Marlene had been worried about Garrett lately. Not anything specific, just that he'd been acting strange. More secretive about his work, taking calls at odd hours. She'd found him once at 3 a.m, hunched over his laptop in their bathroom with the door locked. When she'd asked what he was doing, he'd snapped at her in a way he never had before. Silas shifted in his chair, explaining that his brother had always been intense about work, especially with crypto market volatility. The pressure could change people. My phone buzzed with another update from Garrett. Finally made it to Ohio. Car trouble. Getting it fixed, then back on the road. The message included a photo of a generic auto repair shop. I showed it to Silas, who studied it before saying it looked legitimate enough. But when I mentioned I thought I'd heard strange background noise during our last call, Silas quickly suggested that rest stops often had slot machines perfectly legal in some states. A reasonable explanation, though it came a bit too quickly. The doctor came by with the afternoon update. The latest blood work showed the metal levels decreasing steadily. They'd identified the specific compound lithium carbonate, typically used as a mood stabilizer for bipolar disorder. Marlene had no prescription for it, no history of mental health issues. The levels in her blood suggested chronic exposure over several months. Someone had been carefully poisoning my daughter. The recent spike that caused her collapse had been massive enough to kill if they hadn't caught it in time. The word lithium hung in the air. Silas had gone very still. Nadine's face had drained of color. She whispered that lithium was highly regulated, required prescriptions. Someone with access would have had to obtain it. She didn't look at anyone in particular when she said this. Silas stood abruptly, saying he needed to make some calls, check on some matters. He practically fled the room. Alone with my unconscious daughter and her best friend, Nadine fidgeted with her stethoscope before speaking. Marlene had confided something to her a few weeks ago. She'd found evidence on Garrett's laptop gambling sites, cryptocurrency platforms showing massive losses, hundreds of thousands of dollars gone. Marlene had been planning to confront him, had even consulted a divorce attorney quietly, but then she'd started feeling so sick that she'd put it off. Silas returned an hour later with some paperwork, his composure restored. He'd prepared some standard medical forms, he said, just precautionary measures for Marlene's care. The papers were dense with legal language, but I recognized what they really were: power of attorney forms that would give him significant control. When I asked why this was necessary now, he said it was just being prepared. His hands were perfectly steady now, no trace of that earlier tremor. I told him I'd review everything carefully. After he left to get coffee, I made a call to an old colleague who'd moved into private investigation work. I asked him to look into some financial matters, quietly and carefully. He said he'd have preliminary information within 24 hours. That evening, Nadine returned for the night shift. She mentioned she'd been doing research on lithium poisoning. The symptoms matched Marlene's exactly. For lithium to build up to toxic levels without causing immediate severe symptoms, it would have to be administered carefully, in calculated doses, probably mixed with food or drink. Someone had been playing a long, careful game. She also mentioned, voice dropping, that she'd checked some records. There had been prescriptions for Harry filled at different pharmacies over the past 4 months. Small amounts that wouldn't raise suspicion individually, but together, enough for a poisoning campaign. Night deepened, and the ICU settled into its quiet rhythm. Marlene's condition remained stable. The doctor had said they might be able to reduce ventilator support tomorrow if progress continued. I wanted my daughter to wake up, to tell me what had happened, but part of me also feared what truths might emerge. My phone rang just after midnight, and my investigator contacted me, working late. He'd found concerning information. Garrett had filed for bankruptcy 6 years ago, before meeting Marlene. Since then, he'd been trading on margin, chasing losses with bigger bets. Current debt was at least $2 million, possibly much more. And then he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Marlene had a life insurance policy worth $10 million, taken out 18 months ago. Garrett was the sole beneficiary. There was also information about Silas. His law practice was struggling. He'd made bad investments, owed back taxes. Not desperate like Garrett, but enough financial pressure to make someone consider options they normally wouldn't. More interesting was his involvement with certain medical situations for elderly clients, using his position to facilitate prescription access, always just within legal boundaries. The kind of knowledge that could be very useful for obtaining controlled substances. Dawn approached slowly. Everything was starting to make sense, in the worst possible way. Garrett needed money desperately. Marlene had a massive life insurance policy. Someone had been poisoning her with lithium for months. The pieces fit together in an ugly picture. Silas arrived at 7 sharp with coffee and pastries. He asked about Marlene's condition, seemed relieved at the improvement. Then he mentioned, too casually, that he'd heard from Garrett. His brother had made it to Illinois, was maybe 12 hours away now. He'd asked Silas to handle some financial matters while he traveled. The way Silas presented it was reasonable, but I caught the probe he was fishing for information. Just then, Marlene's hand moved. Not a twitch, but deliberate movement, her fingers curling around mine. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment I saw her mother's green eyes. The monitors showed increased brain activity. The medical team rushed in as Marlene began fighting her way back to consciousness. It was happening faster than expected. Silas had gone pale. He excused himself to call Garrett with the news, but his exit suggested panic more than joy. As medical staff worked to adjust Marlene's treatment, I made a decision. When she woke up, I would make sure she was protected. The photo on the bedside table caught my eye from the pharmacy surveillance my investigator had somehow obtained. It showed a familiar figure at a prescription counter, picking up a small white bag. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. The person in the photo was someone I knew very well. The morning Marlene started breathing on her own was the same morning I decided to dig into my past. They'd removed the ventilator just after dawn. Her breathing had stabilized 16 steady breaths per minute. Her eyes remained closed, but she responded to stimuli. The doctor called it excellent progress. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't forget Silas's panicked face when she'd started waking up. I left Nadine with Marlene and made a call I'd hoped never to make. 20 years since I'd left Vegas. 20 years since I'd walked away from that world. But some debts never really get paid. Some connections never fully severed. The voice that answered recognized me immediately. Eddie, my old boss from the casino days, asked what brought me back after all this time. I told him I needed information, maybe a favor. There was a long pause. Then he gave me an address in Chinatown. The meeting was brief but productive. Eddie had aged badly, but his network remained intact. When I told him about Marlene's poisoning, about Garrett's debts, his expression darkened. Turns out Garrett owed money to the wrong people, $5 million with daily compounding interest, the kind of debt that ended badly. But Garrett had been making promises, saying he'd have $10 million within 3 months. This was 6 weeks ago. The timing lined up perfectly with Marlene's poisoning escalating. Eddie knew about Silas, too. The lawyer brother had a reputation for navigating legal gray areas, helping people with medical situations. He'd built a network of cooperative doctors, understood how to work the prescription system. Never anything prosecutable, always just barely legal. The brothers together were dangerous Garrett's desperation and Silas's knowledge. Eddie offered to help, said there was a game happening in 2 days where Garrett would try to win back what he owed. I could be there, could ensure certain conditions were met. Justice served in a different kind of court. Back at the hospital, I found Nadine in tears of joy. Marlene had opened her eyes, had tried to speak, though her throat was too damaged from the ventilator. She was writing notes on a pad, shaky but legible. The first thing she'd written was, "Dad?" When I entered, her face crumpled with relief. She reached for me weakly, and I held her hand while she wrote more. Knew something wrong. Couldn't prove. So tired. I showed Marlene the evidence I'd gathered: photos, receipts, records. Her expression hardened as she looked at them, and she wrote one word: lies. Then she pointed at a specific receipt and wrote, "Never bought." Garrett did, said helping. She was confirming what I'd suspected: Garrett had been buying the supplies, adding lithium to her protein shakes. She wrote that the shakes had started tasting strange about 2 months ago, salty and metallic, but Garrett said it was a new formula. Silas arrived, looking desperate. He'd brought more papers, saying they were urgent medical directives. But I'd learned to read legal documents carefully. These were financial power of attorney forms. I pretended to consider them while stalling. Then Marlene made a sound, a rasping whisper. "No, Silas. No." His face went white. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. She wrote on her pad, both of them. Garrett called Silas before the trip. Heard planning. Silas grabbed for the papers and fled when Nadine blocked his path. She'd been documenting everything: symptoms, timelines, prescriptions filled for Harry at various pharmacies. She didn't accuse him directly, just laid out facts. But the implication was clear. If anything happened to Marlene now, there would be questions. That evening, Marlene grew stronger by the hour. She told me about finding Garrett's laptop open to gambling sites, about confronting him and being dismissed. She told me about the sudden illness after that confrontation, how Garrett had been so attentive with special shakes and vitamins. She'd suspected something but had been too sick to act, too confused by the lithium. She'd stopped drinking the shakes 3 days before her collapse, had been pouring them out. The massive dose must have been in the coffee Garrett brought her that morning. As night fell, I told Marlene about my past, about Vegas, about understanding how desperate men think. I told her about Eddie and the game and what was going to happen to Garrett. She listened without judgment, then said something that reminded me she was definitely my daughter. "Make him pay, Dad. Make them both pay." The burner phone Eddie had given me buzzed with details. An address in Koreatown. A time, a password. The game was set. Marlene nodded when I showed her. Then she wrote something that chilled me. "Silas will be there too. Has to be. They're in this together." She was right. 2 brothers, 2 conspirators, both desperate in their own ways. In 2 days, everything would be settled. I looked down at the evidence spread across the hospital bed: pharmacy photos, bank records, the old poker chip with IOU 5M that had started this investigation. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Tomorrow night, the house would collect all debts. The next morning brought confirmation of everything we'd suspected. My investigator had sent more evidence: overnight pharmacy records obtained through a whistleblower, surveillance footage from a security contact at Walgreens. 12 prescriptions for lithium carbonate filled under variations of Harry's name over 4 months. The surveillance was grainy but clear. Garrett at 3 locations, Silas at 2 others. Both picked up small white bags that contained poison. Garrett finally showed up at the hospital at 10:30 that night, looking haggard and desperate. The fluorescent lights in the corridor cast harsh shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 42 years. His shirt was wrinkled and untucked on one side, and there was a coffee stain on his collar that looked fresh. He rushed to Marlene's bedside with a performance of concern that might have been convincing if we hadn't known the truth. His hands shook as he reached for hers, and I noticed the dirt under his fingernails, as if he'd been digging or clawing at something. The smell of stale cigarettes and fear of sweat clung to him like a second skin. He sobbed, the sound raw and broken in the quiet hospital room. The tears came easily, too easily, running down his stubbled cheeks while he apologized over and over. He blamed delayed flights that had kept him stranded at the airport for hours. He described car trouble on the highway, a blown tire that had left him waiting for roadside assistance in the dark. His voice cracked as he explained how his phone had died, leaving him unable to call. Each excuse tumbled out faster than the last, words tripping over themselves in his desperation to be believed. Marlene watched him with cold calculation from her hospital bed. The IV drip beside her bed clicked steadily, marking time like a metronome. Her face was still pale from the poisoning, but her eyes were sharp and clear. tracking every movement he made. The machines monitoring her vital signs beeped softly in the background, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock the chaos of Garrett's arrival. When he finally paused for breath, gasping like a drowning man, she spoke in a voice still rough from the tube they'd used to pump her stomach, but perfectly clear in its accusation. "I know what you did." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. His reaction told us everything we needed to know. Not denial, not confusion, but immediate panic flashing across his features before he tried to school them into something resembling innocence. His eyes darted to the door, then to me, then back to Marlene. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He started to speak, stopped, swallowed hard, and tried again. He tried gaslighting her, his voice taking on a soothing, patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. He said she was confused, that the poison had affected her mind and she wasn't thinking clearly. He reached out to stroke her hair, but she pulled away, her movement sharp despite her weakness. He insisted the doctors had warned him about hallucinations and paranoia as side effects. His performance was desperate now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool hospital air conditioning. But when I laid out the pharmacy records on the bedside table, spreading them across the thin hospital blanket like playing cards, his face went white as the sheets beneath them. The papers rustled in the silence, each one damning in its precision. The prescriptions were all there, dates and dosages meticulously documented. The surveillance photos from 3 different pharmacies showed him clearly, baseball cap pulled low, but not low enough to hide his features. In one photo, he was signing for the lithium with his own credit card. In another, he was stuffing pill bottles into a grocery bag, looking over his shoulder like a common thief. He started to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The words wouldn't come. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Finally, he asked for Silas. He needed his brother, needed legal advice, needed someone to tell him how to make this go away. The desperation in his voice was raw and real now, no longer a performance. It was as close to a confession as we'd get without him actually saying the words. Marlene pulled out her pad from the bedside drawer, her movements deliberate despite the tremor in her hands. The pen scratched across the paper, each stroke precise and angry. She held it up for Garrett to see. His face crumpled as he read the words she'd written in her careful script. "The coffee that morning tasted like salt. You watched me drink it." He didn't even try to deny it this time. His shoulders slumped, and he stared at the floor, at the scuffed linoleum tiles that had seen so much suffering. The pattern in the tiles seemed to hold his attention, swirls of beige and gray that looked like storm clouds. He mumbled about pressure that had been building for months, about debts that kept him awake at night. He talked about phone calls at 3 a.m, threats that started vague but got more specific. He said he'd had no choice, that they would have hurt them both if he didn't pay. Marlene wrote again, her pen pressing so hard it nearly tore through the paper. She turned the pad toward him with steady hands. $10 million. My life insurance. Worth more than me? This time he just nodded. Defeated. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but it was enough. The weight of his betrayal seemed to physically crush him, and he sank into the visitor's chair beside her bed. The vinyl squeaked under his weight. He put his head in his hands, and for a moment the only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor and the distant murmur of voices from the nurse's station down the hall. Silas arrived 20 minutes later, his footsteps quick and purposeful in the corridor before he even reached the room. He was wearing his lawyer suit, the expensive one he saved for court appearances, as if proper attire could somehow make this situation legitimate. His face was composed until he saw the pharmacy records spread across the bed. Then something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of calculations being made and discarded. He immediately went into lawyer mode, his voice taking on that professional tone that brooked no argument. He told Garrett not to say anything more, that they needed to leave immediately. He started gathering the papers, but I put my hand over them, holding them in place. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time, and I saw recognition dawn in his eyes. He knew who I was, what I represented in this equation. I stood between them and the door, blocking their exit without making it seem like a threat. The hallway behind me was empty, but we all knew there were cameras recording everything. I told them about tomorrow night's game, the one Garrett was already planning to attend because he had no choice. The buy-in alone would clean out what little he had left, but showing up empty-handed would be worse. I'd be there too, I assured them. We'd settle everything then, all debts and obligations handled at once. Walking away now would only make things worse with the people Garrett owed money to. They both knew that missing this game wasn't an option. The people running it didn't accept excuses, didn't care about family emergencies or legal troubles. You showed up when summoned, or you faced consequences that made bankruptcy look appealing. Silas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He understood the stakes, even if he didn't like them. After they left, their footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor, Marlene broke down completely. Not from fear, but from rage at the betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Her body shook with the force of her anger, and I helped her sit up straighter in the bed, adjusting the pillows behind her back. The tears came then, hot and angry, streaming down her face while she told me things she'd kept hidden for months. She described how Garrett had been asking strange questions about her health and insurance policies, casual inquiries that seemed caring at the time. He'd wanted to know about her family medical history, about any conditions that ran in the family. He'd suggested they both get complete physicals, just to be safe as they got older. She'd thought it was sweet, a sign that he was thinking about their future together. The protein shakes had been his idea too, part of a new health kick he'd claimed to be on. He'd bought an expensive blender and organic protein powder, making a show of preparing them together every morning. He'd always made hers special, adding extra vitamins he said would help with her energy levels. She'd drunk poison with a smile, thanking him for taking care of her while he watched her swallow every drop. The doctor came by with more test results as the sun began to set outside the window, casting long shadows across the hospital room. He was young, probably a resident, with tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He added disturbing details to what we already knew, his voice clinical, but tinged with disgust at what the tests revealed. The lithium levels in Marlene's hair showed a clear timeline that made my stomach turn. Low doses starting 4 months ago, barely noticeable, just enough to cause mild symptoms that could be attributed to stress or aging. The doses had gradually increased over time, following a careful progression that suggested medical knowledge. Every 2 weeks, there were massive spikes in the levels, as if someone had been testing her tolerance, seeing how much her body could handle before showing obvious symptoms. Someone had been carefully calibrating the doses like a sick experiment. It required not just knowledge of pharmacology, but patience and planning. Garrett might have administered the poison, mixing it into her morning shakes, but someone with medical knowledge had guided him through the process. The precision suggested extensive research, careful planning, maybe even testing to get the doses right. There were notes in the margins of the toxicology report about how the lithium had been combined with other substances to mask its taste and delay its effects. The doctor explained how certain compounds could make the poison absorb more slowly, spreading out the damage over time to make it look like natural organ failure. That afternoon, while Marlene dozed fitfully, more information came through from various sources. Eddie had people everywhere, and they'd been digging into Garrett's history with the thoroughness of archaeologists excavating a crime scene. His gambling history was pathetic in its predictability. He'd had initial success with cryptocurrency, turning 5,000 into 50,000 in just 3 months. That early win had convinced him he was smarter than the market, that he had a system. Then came bigger risks, leveraged trades that could multiply gains, but also losses. He'd lost the $50,000 in a single day when the market turned. Instead of walking away, he'd doubled down, borrowing money to make back what he'd lost. Then came the desperate attempts to recover losses through increasingly risky bets. Sports gambling, online poker, anything that promised a quick return. He'd lost $300,000 in one night 6 months ago, a marathon session at an underground casino where the house always won, and walking away wasn't always an option. The debt had snowballed from there, interest compounding daily, penalties adding up. He'd taken out the life insurance policy on Marlene just 2 weeks after that devastating loss, paying the premiums with money borrowed from another source. The paperwork showed he'd lied on the application, claiming Marlene had requested the policy for their financial security. He'd literally bet on his wife's death, treating her life like another hand of cards to be played. Silas's involvement was equally damning, though more carefully concealed. He'd been facilitating prescription access for elderly clients through a network of compliant doctors, always staying just within legal boundaries. His law practice specialized in estate planning, giving him access to vulnerable clients with valuable assets. The practice was struggling, though, hemorrhaging clients to bigger firms with better resources. He'd made bad investments in real estate just before the market corrected, leaving him with properties worth half what he'd paid. He wasn't desperate like Garrett, not facing physical threats or broken bones, but he was desperate enough to help his brothers plan for a cut of the insurance money. They'd worked out the dosing schedule together, Silas providing the medical knowledge gleaned from years of medical malpractice cases, Garrett doing the actual poisoning with shaking hands each morning. The plan had been 18 months in the making, every detail considered except for the possibility that Marlene might survive. I spent the rest of the day with Marlene, sitting in the uncomfortable visitor's chair while she drifted in and out of sleep. When she was awake, we worked together to piece together memories that the lithium had made fuzzy, like looking at old photographs through frosted glass. She remembered feeling paranoid in recent months, doubting her own perceptions when things didn't seem right. She'd found herself questioning whether conversations had really happened, whether she'd imagined the strange taste in her coffee. Garrett had been gaslighting her while poisoning her, a double assault on her reality that left her unable to trust her own judgment. When she'd mentioned feeling tired, he'd suggested she was working too hard. When she'd complained about headaches, he'd bought her expensive supplements that probably contained more lithium. The cruelest part was how the lithium specifically affected cognitive function, making victims question their own judgment even as their bodies betrayed them. As night fell, and the hospital settled into its quieter evening rhythm, I prepared for tomorrow's game with methodical focus. I reviewed all the evidence one more time, preparing documentation that would be irrefutable. Eddie had promised something special for this game. Not just another night of cards, but a judgment that would be remembered. The game itself would be clean. No rigged decks or marked cards. But desperate men always make desperate plays, and Garrett would be the most desperate man at that table. Tomorrow night, Garrett would lose everything while everyone watched. His creditors would know he'd tried to murder his wife for insurance money, that he was the kind of man who would poison someone who loved him for a payout that might never come. His reputation in the gambling world would be destroyed, marked as someone who'd crossed a line that even criminals respected. Silas's legal career would end in disgrace, disbarred for his role in attempted murder, his elderly clients learning how close they'd come to being victims themselves. The machines continued their steady beeping as I watched over Marlene, planning every detail of what would come next. Justice would be served. Just not in any courtroom. I stopped by the hospital one more time before heading to the game venue. Marlene was sleeping peacefully, genuinely resting for the first time. The monitors showed steady improvement. Nadine was on shift and promised to stay close. Tomorrow night, justice would be served in a different kind of court. I looked at the surveillance photos one more time of Garrett and Silas buying poison. their faces clear and undeniable. The contrast was everything. Trust versus betrayal. Love versus greed. Tomorrow, they would face consequences in ways the legal system never could provide. I left the hospital and drove toward Koreatown, toward the warehouse where everything would end. The game would begin at 9, but the verdict had already been decided. The morning of the game, Marlene shocked everyone by sitting up and asking for her laptop. She said she needed to check something before tonight. When I returned with it from her apartment, she immediately pulled up a folder labeled Evidence, dated 3 months ago, long before her collapse. Inside were screenshots of Garrett's gambling losses, recordings, photos, all predating the poisoning by weeks. She'd known about his gambling for months and had been documenting everything for a divorce. She opened an audio file on her laptop, the screen's blue light casting shadows across her hollow cheeks. The speakers crackled for a moment before Garrett's voice filled the hospital room, clear and damning. He was discussing the insurance solution with someone whose voice I didn't recognize, but would later learn was a contact from his gambling circles. The recording quality was surprisingly good, every word distinct, including Garrett's casual discussion of dosages and timelines. The beauty is it mimics depression, Garrett's recorded voice said, while the real Marlene watched me with eyes that held no surprise. Everyone already thinks she's stressed from the startup. A little too much medication, an accidental overdose, tragic, but understandable. The recording was from her phone, she explained, hidden in her pocket during what Garrett thought was a private call in their home office. She'd been standing outside the door, pretending to bring him coffee, when she'd heard enough to start recording. The timestamp showed it was from 6 weeks ago, when the poisoning had already begun, but before the symptoms had become severe. She'd caught him planning murder while she was already being murdered, a timeline that made my hands clench into fists. But by then, the lithium was already affecting her cognitive function, making her doubt what she'd heard. The poison was doing double duty, both killing her and making her question her own perceptions. She'd tried to confront him once, she said, her voice steady despite the horror of the memory. She'd asked about the insurance policy, about why he was so interested in her taking her vitamins. He'd held her, stroked her hair, told her she was getting paranoid from stress, that maybe she should see someone about anxiety. The gaslighting had worked because the poison was clouding her judgment, making her feel crazy for suspecting the man who was killing her. There was more evidence on her laptop, organized into folders with dates and descriptions. Bank transfers to Silas labeled as legal consultation that coincided perfectly with new prescription dates. Each payment was just under $10,000, avoiding federal reporting requirements, but adding up to nearly $60,000 over 3 months. Photos from their home security system showing Garrett at his computer researching lithium toxicity, symptoms of overdose, how long it stayed in the system after death. The security system had been Marlene's idea, installed for her startup's product testing. She needed to document user interactions with prototypes, so she'd set up cameras that also captured screenshots of all devices on the network. Garrett never knew it recorded everything, every search, every email, every message. He'd been building a murder plan on devices that were documenting his every move, supreme confidence mixed with stunning ignorance. Then she showed me something that changed everything about how I saw my daughter. An email she'd sent to herself from 3 weeks ago, written during a day Garrett had forgotten to dose her morning shake. Her mind had cleared just enough to recognize the pattern, to understand what was happening. The email laid out her suspicions with the clarity of someone who knew they might not get another chance to think clearly. "If you're reading this," the email began, "it means I survived long enough to show someone. Garrett is poisoning me. I'm 90% certain. The shakes taste different. I feel worse after drinking them. My symptoms match lithium toxicity. I can't go to the police yet because Silas will help him cover it up. I need more evidence. I need to survive long enough to gather it. The email detailed her plan. She'd stopped drinking the protein shakes, but pretended to continue, pouring them down the sink when Garrett wasn't watching. She'd started taking activated charcoal supplements she'd hidden in tampon boxes, knowing Garrett would never look there. The charcoal would absorb some of the toxins, buying her time. She'd even calculated how much lithium she could tolerate without permanent damage, using her biochemistry background from college to work out the pharmacokinetics. The collapse at her office hadn't been entirely unexpected. She'd felt it coming for days and made sure to be somewhere public, somewhere with people who would call an ambulance immediately. She'd even deleted Garrett's number from her emergency contacts the day before, ensuring the hospital would call me instead. Every detail had been planned by a woman whose brain was being poisoned, who was fighting through fog to save her own life. I stared at my daughter differently now, seeing not just a victim, but a warrior who'd been fighting a battle I hadn't even known existed. She hadn't been just enduring the poisoning. She'd been playing her own game, gathering evidence while pretending to succumb. When I asked why she hadn't gone to the police immediately, she explained with the patience of someone who'd thought through every angle. With Silas involved, with his legal knowledge, a criminal case would be almost impossible. Garrett would claim I was mentally unstable, that I'd been self-medicating for depression. Silas would provide expert testimony about my stress levels, my startup struggles. They'd paint me as a woman who accidentally overdosed, and they'd use my own symptoms against me. I needed them to reveal themselves completely, needed undeniable proof that couldn't be explained away. She'd been counting on me, she said, to find a way to make them face consequences outside the legal system. She knew about my past, about the connections that never quite severed, about the kind of justice that existed in shadows. She'd been betting her life on her father's ability to operate in spaces where law didn't reach. The nurse, Nadine, had been part of it for the last month. When Marlene had first mentioned her suspicions during a moment of clarity, Nadine hadn't dismissed them as lithium-induced paranoia. She'd started documenting everything medical, creating a paper trail that would prove chronic poisoning rather than accidental overdose. Every blood test, every symptom, every improvement when Marlene skipped doses, all carefully recorded in official medical files that would be admissible in court if needed. They'd been playing a dangerous game, betting Marlene could survive long enough to expose the truth. The tremors, the confusion, the kidney strain, all of it endured consciously, knowingly, because the alternative was letting Garrett win. We'd been playing parallel games without knowing it, father and daughter both working toward the same justice from different angles. She pulled up another document on her laptop, a will written 2 weeks ago when she'd had a clear morning. Everything went to charity, specifically to organizations supporting victims of domestic violence. Not a penny to Garrett, not even their shared assets. She'd also changed her insurance beneficiary in a way that showed stunning foresight. Garrett was still the primary beneficiary, but buried in subsection 12 was a clause invalidating his claim if he was found responsible for her death or injury through criminal act or negligence. Silas probably missed it, she said with grim satisfaction. He would have skimmed the document looking for the big picture, not reading every subsection. It's written in dense legal language that looks standard but isn't. I spent my clear hours researching insurance law, making sure it would hold up. She'd been systematically preparing for tonight's revelation, gathering evidence while pretending to fade, building a case while playing victim. The startup founder in her had approached her own poisoning like a problem to solve, breaking it down into components, finding solutions, iterating when things didn't work. My phone buzzed with a text from Eddie. The game would start at 9 that evening, but I should arrive early for a private meeting. Some people wanted to review the evidence beforehand. These weren't police or lawyers, but fathers who understood the rage of someone hurting your daughter. Creditors who took personal offense at Garrett's assumption he could murder his way out of debt. The audience would be carefully selected for maximum impact. It wouldn't be a trial in any legal sense, but it would be judgment in the oldest sense of the word. Marlene insisted on video calling during the game to watch Garrett's face when everything collapsed. She'd earned that right by surviving, by playing her own long game while being slowly destroyed. She wanted to see the moment Garrett realized he'd lost everything, wanted to watch his face when he understood she'd been gathering evidence even as he poisoned her morning coffee. It was the least she deserved after months of torture. I spent the afternoon in my apartment organizing everything we'd gathered. Pharmacy records showing prescriptions that didn't match any legitimate diagnosis. Surveillance photos of Garrett meeting with suppliers, time-stamped and location-tagged. Bank statements with transfers that told a story of preparation and payment. Recordings that would make anyone's blood run cold. Each piece was copied multiple times, backed up to cloud services, prepared for presentation to an audience that would appreciate the thoroughness. As evening approached, I put on my old suit from the casino days, the one I'd worn to high-stakes games when I was younger, and the world was simpler. The fabric still fit, though it hung looser now, age and worry having carved away the excess. In the inside pocket, my fingers found something unexpected. An old poker chip from the Venetian, red and white with gold edging, worth $100 in a game that no longer existed. Tonight, I'd use it as a symbol, something that would mean something specific to certain people in the audience, a callback to debts and honor that transcended money. Marlene called as I was leaving, her voice steady but emotional through the phone speaker. She thanked me for believing her when the poison had made her doubt herself, for finding evidence when she'd been too sick to search, for doing what needed to be done when the law couldn't or wouldn't help. Then she told me something that explained the cold calculation I'd seen in her eyes, the steel beneath the tremors. "I found out about the insurance policy 6 months ago," she said, her words carefully measured. "I was looking for our tax documents and found the policy instead. $2 million with double indemnity for accidental death. I knew what it meant immediately. I had 6 months to prepare for the possibility that my husband would try to kill me. The psychological torture had been as bad as the physical poisoning," she explained. Every meal became a potential threat. Every gesture of affection might be calculation. Every "I love you" might be a lie. She'd lived 6 months knowing her husband was capable of killing her for money, waiting to see if he'd actually do it, unable to leave without triggering something worse. I drove to Koreatown as the sun set, the sky turning the color of old blood. The familiar streets looked different now, charged with purpose. This wasn't about money anymore. It had transcended that. It was about family, about betrayal at the most fundamental level. Garrett had violated something sacred, had broken laws older than any government. In the old world, the one that existed in shadows and understanding, there were rules about families, lines that weren't crossed. Garrett had crossed them all. The warehouse sat on a corner lot, looking abandoned from the outside but humming with hidden life. I was led through a series of doors to a private room where Eddie sat with 3 other men. All were fathers. All understood viscerally what was about to happen. They reviewed the evidence I'd brought, their expressions growing darker with each piece. These were men who had done terrible things in their lives, who operated outside conventional morality, but even they had limits. Poisoning your wife for insurance money violated every code they lived by. "This is thorough," one said, looking at the bank records. "Your daughter did good work." "She's strong," another added, reviewing the medical files. "To survive this while gathering evidence, that takes something special." Garrett arrived at 8:45 with Silas, both trying to project confidence, but failing in different ways. Garrett's hands shook as he signed the entry log, while Silas's eyes darted around, looking for exits that wouldn't help him. They'd been escorted through a different entrance, hadn't seen the audience gathering behind one-way glass, the creditors and fathers and men who understood certain kinds of justice. Garrett had dressed for success in a suit that probably cost 2 months of his legitimate salary, but sweat was already beading on his forehead despite the cool evening. He knew this was his last chance to solve his problems. What he didn't know was that his last chance had evaporated the moment he'd decided to poison Marlene, that he'd been playing a game he'd already lost, that tonight wasn't about money but about something much older and more final. The game would begin in 10 minutes. Garrett would be given the illusion of hope. Then, piece by piece, everything would be stripped away. At the perfect moment, when he thought he'd hit bottom, the real show would begin. The evidence would be presented. Marlene would appear on screen, and everyone would understand exactly what kind of man sat at their table. I took my seat in the observation room, burner phone ready to connect Marlene's call, and watched as Garrett picked up his chips, calculating odds that had already been determined against him. The first hour of the game was almost painful to watch. Garrett played conservatively at first, feeling out the other players, trying to read patterns and tells. He won a few small hands, enough to build false confidence, enough to make him think he had a chance. The other players were professionals in their own way, not card sharps, but men who understood psychology, who knew how to let a desperate man hang himself with his own rope. They fed him just enough wins to keep him engaged. Small victories that meant nothing against the mountain of debt crushing him. Eddie sat beside me, occasionally commenting on Garrett's tells of the way he touched his wedding ring when bluffing, how his left eye twitched when he had a good hand. By the second hour of the game, the atmosphere in the warehouse had transformed from tense anticipation to something darker, heavier, like the air before an execution. The stakes escalated dramatically with each hand, small bets of thousands becoming tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands per round. The chips made soft clicking sounds as they moved across the felt table, each one representing more money than most people saw in a year. Garrett's initial winnings, that false confidence from the early hands, evaporated like water in the desert heat. His hands began to shake visibly as he arranged his chips, the neat stacks becoming progressively messier as his control slipped. He started making fundamental mistakes that even amateur players would avoid. Calling when the odds screamed to fold, his chips sliding across the table toward a pot he had no chance of winning. Folding when his position was strong, throwing away winning hands because fear had clouded his judgment. The mathematical certainty of his destruction was playing out in real time, each decision worse than the last, a cascade of errors that would have been fascinating if it weren't so pathetic. Silas leaned close to whisper advice, his breath probably reeking of the whiskey he'd been drinking to steady his nerves. But Garrett brushed off the suggestions with increasing irritation, his hand swatting at his brother like he was an annoying insect. Pride was accelerating his downfall, the same hubris that had convinced him he could murder his wife and collect insurance money without consequence. At 11:30, the digital display showing the pot values glowed red in the dim light. Garrett was down $300,000, his face the color of old paper, sweat staining the collar of his expensive shirt, despite the cool temperature in the warehouse. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. "I need a bathroom break," he said, his voice cracking on the word need. Silas stood immediately, following his brother toward the restrooms at the back of the warehouse. Through the security monitors in our observation room, we watched them argue in the harsh fluorescent light of the bathroom. The cameras had no audio, but their body language told the story clearly. Silas's hands moved in sharp, cutting gestures, obviously telling Garrett to stop, to accept the losses, to walk away while he still could. Garrett's response was violent head-shaking, his finger jabbing at Silas's chest, his mouth forming words that were probably about winning it back, about just needing one good hand. It was the same delusion that had led him to poison Marlene, the belief that one big move could solve all his problems. They returned to the table after 5 minutes, Garrett walking with renewed determination that was actually just desperation wearing a mask. His steps were too quick, too purposeful, like someone walking toward a cliff they've convinced themselves is solid ground. The pivotal hand came at exactly midnight, the witching hour when bad decisions become disasters. The dealer, a woman with hands that moved like water, distributed the cards with practiced efficiency. Garrett picked up his cards, and his entire demeanor changed instantly. The nervous energy that had been consuming him transformed into barely contained excitement. His pupils dilated, his breathing quickened, his fingers drummed once on the table before he caught himself. He'd been dealt pocket aces, the best starting hand in Texas Hold'em poker. The probability of getting this hand was roughly 1 in 220, and Garrett knew he'd just caught lightning. His hand was nearly unbeatable pre-flop, and he knew it. He bet aggressively, pushing forward chips worth $100,000 with the confidence of someone who thought fate had finally turned in his favor. 2 players folded immediately, recognizing the aggression as strength. But 1 player, a man who'd been silent most of the night, stayed in, matching Garrett's raise without hesitation. The dealer burned a card and revealed the flop. Ace of hearts, king of diamonds, queen of clubs. Garrett had hit his set. 3 aces. The odds of someone beating this hand were astronomical. His hands were steady for the first time all night as he pushed more chips forward. Another 200,000. The towers of chips reflecting the overhead lights like a city skyline. The other player considered for a long moment, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his cards, then raised another 200,000. Garrett's eyes lit up with the fever of someone who thinks they're about to win everything back. He thought his opponent was bluffing, thought this was his moment of redemption. He looked at his remaining chips, roughly 400,000 in various denominations. He looked at Silas, whose face had gone pale with understanding of what was about to happen. He looked at the pot that could save him from everything, that could erase his debts and give him another chance. Then he spoke the words that sealed his fate, his voice clear and strong for the first time all night. All in. The words seemed to echo in the warehouse, bouncing off the metal roof and concrete walls. Everyone around the table went still, even the dealer pausing before confirming the bet. The other player called immediately, no hesitation, no consideration, just immediate acceptance. The remaining cards were dealt quickly, the turn and river meaningless formalities. Garrett flipped his 3 aces with a flourish, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in hours. The smile lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took for his opponent to reveal Jack 10 suited, both spades, a straight, ace high. It beat Garrett's set by the slimmest of margins, but in poker, margins didn't matter. You either won or you lost. The blood drained from Garrett's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He sat frozen, staring at the cards as if they might change if he looked hard enough. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Just a soft wheeze like air escaping from a punctured tire. The dealer collected the chips with efficient sweeps of her hands, the sound of them clicking together like applause for his destruction. Garrett had nothing left. No chips, no money, no options. He started to stand, his legs shaky, probably thinking he could just walk away, that this was where it ended. But Eddie's voice came over the speaker system, calm and final. "The game isn't over, Mr. Harry. Please remain seated." The lights in the observation room brightened suddenly, the one-way glass becoming transparent, revealing our presence to the players. Garrett's shock at seeing me was absolute. His mouth opened in a perfect O of surprise, no sound emerging, his eyes darting between me and the glass as if trying to process this impossibility. Silas went rigid beside him, his lawyer instincts probably screaming that this was bad, this was catastrophically bad. Eddie entered the main room with 2 of the audience members, fathers whose daughters were everything to them. Men who understood viscerally what Garrett had tried to do. They took seats at the table, not to play cards, but to witness what came next. Their faces were stone, their eyes never leaving Garrett, who seemed to shrink under their gaze. Eddie placed a laptop on the green felt table and opened it to face Garrett. The screen came to life, and there was Marlene, propped up in her hospital bed, but very much alive and very much aware. The hospital's fluorescent lights made her look pale, but couldn't diminish the fire in her eyes. Those eyes met Garrett's through the camera, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several people actually shivered. "Hello, Garrett," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in her features. "Surprised to see me conscious? Surprised to see me at all?" For the next 10 minutes, Marlene told everyone about the morning smoothies Garrett had so lovingly prepared, each one containing carefully measured amounts of lithium. She described the symptoms with clinical precision. The unquenchable thirst that had her drinking gallons of water. The tremors that made holding a pen impossible. The cognitive fog that made her doubt her own name some days. She spoke without emotion, like a doctor describing a case study, which somehow made it worse. "The first time, I thought it was stress," she said, looking directly at the camera. "The second time, I thought I was getting sick. By the third time, I knew my husband was trying to kill me." Then came the evidence presentation. The wall behind the poker table lit up with projections, pharmacy surveillance photos filling the space. There was Garrett, clearly visible, purchasing lithium supplements from 3 different pharmacies, always paying cash, always wearing a baseball cap he never wore anywhere else. Audio recordings played through the warehouse's sound system, Garrett's voice discussing dosages with someone, calculating how much would be fatal versus how much would just cause symptoms. The men around the table listened with expressions growing darker with each revelation. These were not good men, not moral men, but even they had codes. Even they had lines. And Garrett had crossed them all. But the most damaging evidence came from Marlene herself. She revealed something she'd kept hidden even from me. A camera in their bedroom disguised as a phone charger. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Garrett in their kitchen at 5 in the morning, when he thought she was still asleep. He measured white powder on a digital scale, the kind drug dealers use, careful to get the exact amount. He stirred it into her protein smoothie, even using a separate spoon to taste it, making sure the flavor was masked. "I found the camera footage only after my collapse," Marlene said. "My friend Nadine retrieved the memory card while Garrett was at the hospital, pretending to be the concerned husband." Eddie asked if Garrett had anything to say in his defense. His response was predictable, but still pathetic to watch. First came denial, his voice high and desperate. "This is fabricated! Deep fakes! She's lying!" Then blame shifting. "Silas told me to do it. He said it was the only way. He got the drugs." Silas's expression at this betrayal was something to see. Shock transformed into rage, his face flushing red, then purple. He started to stand, maybe to attack his brother, maybe to leave. But one look from Eddie had him sitting back down. Finally, Garrett resorted to pleading, tears streaming down his face, snot running from his nose. "Please, I'll leave. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. I'll sign anything, give her everything. Please." The creditor who'd staked Garrett spoke for the first time all night, his voice soft, but carrying clearly through the warehouse. "Mr. Harry, you now owe $7 million with interest, due immediately. But more than money, you owe a debt of honor. You took our money under false pretenses, promising a payoff from your wife's death that will never come." He stood and walked around the table slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing. He stopped behind Garrett and leaned down to whisper something. Whatever he said made Garrett's face go from white to green, his whole body beginning to shake. The creditor straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked out without another word. Silas tried one last desperate gambit, pulling out legal documents from his briefcase, agreements and contracts that might protect them. But one of the audience members simply took the papers and fed them into a shredder that had been brought in for this purpose. The mechanical grinding of paper being destroyed seemed unnecessarily loud. "Your legal career is over," the man told Silas matter-of-factly. "Evidence of your prescription fraud has already been sent to the state bar, the DEA, and several other interested parties. You have 48 hours to surrender your license voluntarily or face criminal prosecution. Your choice." But Marlene wasn't done. She had saved the cruelest revelation for last. She pulled up financial records on her laptop, turning the screen toward the camera so everyone could see. 2 days before her collapse, while Garrett thought she was too sick to function, she'd transferred all their joint assets into accounts only she could access. She'd liquidated his cryptocurrency holdings using passwords she'd found in his poorly hidden notebook, donating everything to women's shelters and domestic violence organizations. "Those expensive watches you love so much?" she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I swapped them with replicas months ago. The real ones have already been sold. Your car? I transferred it to my name 3 weeks ago through paperwork you signed without reading, thinking it was insurance documentation." Every material thing Garrett thought he possessed was already gone. She'd been systematically destroying his life while he'd been trying to end hers. The poetry of it was beautiful in its cruelty, a perfect symmetry of destruction. The morning brought news through various channels. Silas had been arrested at LAX trying to board a flight to Mexico, caught with fraudulent prescriptions and evidence of his involvement in the poisoning. Garrett had been admitted to a psychiatric facility, genuinely catatonic now, unable to speak or respond to stimuli. The creditors had seized all remaining assets, which amounted to nothing since Marlene had already stripped everything of value. The insurance company had been notified of the attempted fraud and had launched their own investigation. The house was being prepared for sale, with proceeds going to Marlene's designated charities. Every thread of Garrett and Silas's plan had been pulled, and the entire fabric of their lives had unraveled. The numbers had balanced perfectly 2 conspirators, 0 assets, infinite consequences. On the table, Garrett's wedding ring lay forgotten, the last remnant of a marriage built on lies. 3 months later, I sat with Marlene in her new apartment overlooking the Pacific. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors that still smelled faintly of fresh varnish. She'd chosen this place carefully, on the 7th floor of a building with multiple exits and security cameras in every hallway. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, its surface glittering like scattered diamonds under the California sun. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below provided a constant rhythm, soothing in its predictability after months of chaos. She'd sold everything from her old life, conducting estate sales with the efficiency of someone erasing history, the furniture she'd shared with Garrett, the kitchen appliances he'd used to prepare her poisoned drinks, the bed where she'd lain awake, wondering why she felt so sick every morning. All of it had been catalogued, priced, and removed by strangers who had no idea they were buying artifacts of attempted murder. She kept just enough to start fresh, choosing each item with deliberate care. A new coffee maker that she alone would use, a set of dishes in ocean blue that bore no memories, a bed with fresh sheets that had never known betrayal. Her startup had pivoted dramatically in the wake of her experience. Instead of general health monitoring through wearable devices, they now focused on detecting poisoning and domestic abuse through biomarkers that most doctors wouldn't think to check. The technology could identify unusual patterns in heart rate variability, subtle changes in skin conductivity, and chemical traces in saliva that might indicate chronic exposure to toxins. She'd turned trauma into purpose, with the precision of someone who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. The spare bedroom office overflowed with medical journals marked with colored tabs. Marlene spent hours on video calls with toxicologists and domestic violence experts, building her mission. Every survivor reaching out through their website justified her terrifying weeks of playing victim while gathering evidence. The lithium left permanent damage. Tremors made holding coffee cups challenging on bad days. Kidney issues required regular monitoring and strict diet management. She took protective medications each morning with filtered water while watching the ocean, wearing these scars like war medals. Garrett existed somewhere in the desert, transferred to a psychiatric facility for a criminal psychology study. The facility pushed ethical boundaries for scientific advancement. He'd regained some physical function, could walk with assistance and feed himself, but remained dissociated from reality, speaking only in numbers and financial terms. He'd become what he'd tried to make Marlene, a test subject whose suffering served a greater purpose. Researchers studied his brain patterns and neural pathways, publishing papers using case study designations, turning his pathology into academic currency. Silas took a different path after his arrest for conspiracy and prescription fraud. His lawyer's instinct for self-preservation kicked in immediately. He provided evidence about prescription fraud networks across 3 states, exposing doctors selling prescriptions for cash and pharmacists who looked away. His testimony brought down years of medical fraud harming elderly victims. He received 3 years in minimum security instead of 15 to 20. The federal facility housed white-collar criminals where violence was rare, but shame constant. The Bar Association's public censure destroyed his reputation permanently. His wife divorced him within weeks, taking the suburban house, unfrozen investment accounts, and full custody of their 2 children. He now worked in the prison library, organizing legal texts for other inmates. Nadine visited weekly from San Diego, sometimes daily during Marlene's bad days. Together, they'd created a foundation providing free toxicology testing for poisoning victims. Operating from 3 small rooms in downtown Los Angeles with second-hand furniture, they'd identified 12 poisoning cases in 6 months, including a teacher whose husband added antifreeze to smoothies and an elderly man whose caregiver overdosed him on sleeping medication. The insurance company found clear evidence of Garrett's fraud in carelessly sent emails. They refused his claim and filed criminal charges. They validated Marlene's disability claim and medical coverage. The $10 million policy remained active with charities as beneficiaries, a reminder of her life's perceived worth. I returned to Chicago, but flew to Los Angeles monthly. We were co-conspirators now, bonded by the terrible game we'd won. She knew my past, everything I'd never told anyone. Instead of judgment, she showed understanding. We'd both played long games against dangerous opponents, learning calculation beats emotion every time. The media briefly covered, "Tech founder survives husband's poisoning plot," simplifying the story for public consumption. The full truth stayed hidden. Marlene turning her poisoning into a weapon, Eddie orchestrating the confrontation, the complete destruction beyond legal consequences. Eddie's message came 3 weeks later. The house is satisfied. All debts settled. Garrett's gambling debts cleared through his research program participation. Marlene had standing offers to enter Eddie's world formally. She'd declined politely. The hardest conversation came at sunset when Marlene asked if I would have let her die to catch him. I answered honestly. I didn't know. The father in me wanted protection at any cost. The part about understanding long games might have let her play it out. She nodded, satisfied with the honesty. We were similar, both willing to sacrifice for perfect outcomes. Recovery continued unpredictably. Initial dialysis 3 times weekly before kidney function slowly returned. Cognitive effects persisted, word-finding difficulties and passing confusion. Therapy sessions focused on recalibration, learning to trust without calculating threat levels. The therapist didn't know why Marlene sometimes smiled discussing her poisoning. The smile was about victory. The complete defeat of those who'd tried destroying her. One evening, as fog rolled in from the ocean and obscured the view from her windows, Marlene showed me something she'd been working on. It was a manuscript for a book about patterns in domestic violence cases. She'd analyzed how financial fraud often preceded physical violence, documenting behavioral changes that indicated planning, and exploring the intersection of debt and desperation that drove people to unthinkable acts. She'd reviewed hundreds of cases from public records and foundation files, creating a predictive model that could identify potential victims before they were harmed. It was brilliant and unsettling in equal measure, a mathematical approach to understanding evil that only someone who'd lived through it could create. Hidden in the formulas and case studies would be her own story, encoded for those who knew how to read between the lines. She wanted other potential victims to recognize the signs she'd almost missed, to understand that love and murder could coexist in the same person. "The house always wins," she said one night, using the phrase I'd taught her years ago when she was younger and still believed in simple justice. "But only if the house knows it's playing." She was right in ways that went beyond gambling metaphors. Garrett had thought he was playing against her alone, a simple game of poisoner versus victim. He hadn't realized he was playing against a system that included me with my connections and experience, Eddie with his resources and brutal sense of justice, Nadine with her unwavering loyalty, the insurance company with their investigators, and the creditors who had their own interest in seeing him pay. But most importantly, the house had included Marlene herself, aware and calculating from the first bitter sip of poisoned coffee, playing victim while gathering evidence, risking everything for complete victory. 2 weeks after showing me her manuscript, news came through Eddie's channels about the research facility. They'd published their first peer-reviewed paper about Garrett's case, anonymized but recognizable to anyone who knew the story. He'd become a landmark case study in criminal narcissism and financial desperation leading to attempted murder. His brain scans showed abnormalities in areas associated with empathy and moral reasoning. His psychological evaluations revealed a personality that could compartmentalize love and murder without experiencing conflict. His name would never appear in academic literature, but his patterns would be taught in criminology and psychology programs for decades to come. He'd wanted to be remembered, to matter in some significant way. He'd succeeded, just not how he'd planned. Instead of being remembered as a successful man who'd overcome gambling addiction, he'd become a cautionary tale told in clinical language. His legacy was as subject number 47 in a study about how financial pressure could transform ordinary people into attempted killers. The final validation for everything Marlene had risked came from an unexpected source 6 months after Garrett's destruction. A woman contacted her through the Foundation website with a message that made Marlene cry for the first time since her recovery. The woman had recognized the symptoms Marlene had described in a blog post about her experience: the metallic taste in morning coffee, the gradual cognitive decline dismissed as stress, the tremors attributed to too much caffeine. She'd tested herself using one of the Foundation's free kits and found lithium in her system at dangerous levels. Her husband was arrested the next day and confessed immediately when confronted with the test results. He'd been following Garrett's case in the news and thought he could do it better, more carefully. He hadn't counted on his victim being aware of the signs. She'd lived because Marlene had survived first and shared her story. One saved life justified everything. The risk Marlene had taken, the suffering she'd endured, the terrible game she'd played with her own life as the stakes. I returned to Chicago permanently after that visit, confident that Marlene was not just surviving, but thriving in her unique way. We talked weekly by phone, sometimes about her work with the foundation, sometimes about nothing important at all. The crisis had passed, leaving us both changed, but closer than we'd ever been. We never discussed Garrett or Silas anymore, except in the most clinical terms. They'd become footnotes in a story about survival, numbers that had been balanced and forgotten, men who'd gambled everything and lost to a house they never knew they were playing against. The last time I visited, Marlene had redecorated her apartment. On the wall hung a single piece of art, a framed display of numbers that told our story. The atomic weight of lithium, the number of days she'd been poisoned, the survival percentage for her toxicity level, the amount donated to charity. At the bottom, in small text, numbers never lie, people do. It was a monument to survival, to patience, to the long game played perfectly. The house had won, completely and forever. What would you do if you discovered your spouse was slowly poisoning you for money? Would you trust the system or take matters into your own hands? Please share your thoughts to the comment below.